All right, let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 4 tonight. We're going to continue our studies through the book of Daniel. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 18. Now, we wanted to take this in 2 weeks because it's such a good chapter, I hate to rush through it. Back in 606 BC, Daniel was about 16 years old when his friends and he were taken by Nebuchadnezzar, a young world power man who had really just taken over the world. And they were taken into custody and brought 600-700 miles away to Babylon, trained for 3 years in the customs of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, false religion, lots of idols. But Daniel is that guy that God sent ahead so that he might have a representative, even in this captive government, where his people would spend 70 years to learn not to be idolatrous. That's really what they were called not to do. So we've been looking at Daniel's life from the time he's 16, and we will follow him until he's well into his 80s. And we've been looking at the dares that Daniel gives us from his life. In chapter 2 and 3, after he graduated, Daniel is only 19 or 20 when the king has a dream he can't remember. And it would be a dream that the Lord gave him to tell him about how the kingdoms of the world would unfold, beginning with him all the way until the time that Jesus would come to rule upon the earth. One kingdom after the other. Even the kingdom of the Antichrist, as he gets this very interesting vision, but Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know it. And he can't remember it, though he's had it several times. He calls for the wise men of the Babylonians, the magicians, the guys that really don't know a thing. And they don't know anything. It's with the gods to know what you dream. We can tell you what it means. We can't tell you what you dreamed. The king, so angry in his powerful position, orders them all to be killed. And in the process, they come to Daniel's house and his boys. And Daniel said, "Could you give me some time? I'd like to pray and ask our God. He is the one who reveals secrets." And the king, desperate to know, said, "Yes." And God gave to Daniel the interpretation. He went and he told the king something that the king probably didn't want to hear, that his kingdom was not going to last forever. He was this head of gold in this vision, but there was following him other world kingdoms that would rule after him. The chest and the arms of silver, the belly and the thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, and then the feet, iron mixed with clay. And we went over them in some detail if you weren't with us that week in chapter 2. We'll catch up with all of those again in the weeks that follow after chapter 6. But Daniel's like 19, 20 years old. Between chapter 2 and 3, 20-some years roll by. Daniel is now in his mid-40s. Nebuchadnezzar is still ruling. Daniel has been there now for 25 years. And the boys are now, I said, in their early 40s, and Daniel is away on business when the three boys that were with him faced a tougher and a more cocky and confident Nebuchadnezzar who, rather than having been moved by the likes of Daniel and his ability and his God to tell him what he was dreaming, just feels like now he's got full charge. And so Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really buckle or he's not moved. He should have been, but he builds this image. And it's not just the image of a head of gold, which he was in that dream, but the Lord said one day your kingdom will come to an end. He made the whole image of gold, 90 feet tall. Made everybody come and worship it and bow down, demanded everyone in every place just call him Lord and make him king, God of their life. And the three boys just couldn't do it. And we looked at the story last week. And this king is more defiant and his plan to be worshipped, stronger than ever. And he defies the vision of 2 decades earlier. And the boys get tossed into the fiery furnace and then they survive. Now, if the dream being told you didn't do it, 20 years later, now you got kids that don't burn up in a fire, but your soldiers who throw them in are dead. You might want to go, well, I should maybe pay attention. And we talked about daring to, last week, stand out for the Lord. Well, tonight we jump, if you will, another 20 years or so in total forward. 20 years between chapter 2 and 3, 23 to be exact, another 20 or so. There are 7 years in the dream itself, another year where Nebuchadnezzar, according to verse 29 of this chapter, kind of held on and didn't listen, and then after a warning, another year of grace, then God began to deal with him for 7 more years. But Daniel is now close to 60 years old. He's been in captivity for the better part of 45 years. They have shined as lights in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes. And if Nebuchadnezzar wondered at all if he was the world ruler, he doesn't wonder anymore. There is nobody left to fight. Historically, he was king of the hill. And no one even had a clear challenge, if you will, to his throne. And so he had overthrown the world, and with nothing left to threaten him, again, he goes back to that prideful, who's the man kind of guy. Back in chapter 1, I think just the first 2 verses, we had read about Nebuchadnezzar coming to Jerusalem and taking some of the articles out of the house of God in Jerusalem and putting them in the house of his gods. And that maybe told us kind of where he was coming from. But over the last 45 years, this evil man has ruled supreme. And I think there's something to be said for the fact that just because evil men have temporary victory, that hardly means God's defeated or that God somehow has lost control. But that's what Nebuchadnezzar thought by the end of chapter 3. He had it all together. It was his for the taking. And so all of the things that God had sent into his life, and I would suggest to you, if you saw people coming out of a burning fire, your life is going to change. His didn't. If you can't remember what you dreamed and someone comes and says to you, I can tell you exactly what you dreamed and what it meant, and it hits home, that's going to change you. It didn't change Nebuchadnezzar, at least not on the surface. And with every passing year, he fights against this whole issue where he wants to be Lord of everything. In chapter 2, the Lord had said to Nebuchadnezzar, the glory of your kingdom I have given to you, but unlike my kingdom, yours will have an end. And so, in both places, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged it for a time. In chapter 2, hey, we only worship the God of Daniel, the true and living God. In chapter 3, hey, we don't worship anybody but the gods of, the 3 boys, or the God of the 3 boys. None of our gods matter. But then, right back to his old way of life. And now 20 years later, more successful than ever, he wants to honor himself alone. And then he calls people to worship in the Dura plains, and he defiantly makes an image of himself. And again, God's servants stand by him, and again, he gets this great witness, and again, he puts it off. Look, people can be extremely hard to reach. There are folks I'm sure you have given up on praying for. I prayed for my dad every day for 12 years, and about the 4-year mark I quit, and the 6-year mark I quit, and the 8-year mark I quit, and the 9-year mark I just argued with God all year about him. And then the 11th year, and then one day, unexpectedly, he gives his life to Christ. And I went, wait, that's ridiculous. 12 years. We baptized the guy. I don't believe it was this last baptism, but the baptism before down at the beach. And I said to him, so how long have you known the Lord? He said, 6 weeks. I said, well, congratulations. I said, did you get saved at Morning Star? I said, yeah. I said, who brought you to church? He said, oh, I've been coming for 5 years. And I thought, either I'm doing something wrong, or you ain't listening. How can you just sit year after year? Well, I wanted to be sure. Really? Man, you're slow to be sure. People can be extremely difficult to reach. And Nebuchadnezzar, over a 45-year period, I know we've studied these passages over a 3 or 4 week period, so it's easy to miss the fact that this is half somebody's life if they live to be 90. That's how long Nebuchadnezzar had had the witness and the example and the Spirit of God living before him in the life of Daniel. Chapter 4 we finally get to is not only the recording of how God finally gets a hold of this man, but it is a testimony written from a first-hand perspective. It is written in Nebuchadnezzar's own hand. It is the only portion of Scripture written by a pagan Gentile ruler. It is in Aramaic, as several of these chapters are. Daniel was fluent in it, if you will. But he gives his testimony, and Nebuchadnezzar's on top. And Daniel and the boys are about 60 years old now. They've been there literally their entire life, from 16 to 60. But the impact is phenomenal because this world ruler comes to know the Lord. And he wants people to know what God has done. In fact, he writes a tract about his salvation and demands that the nations of the world that he controls read it. He writes about being king of the world. He writes about losing his mind for some 7 years before coming to the realization, and this is his big lesson, there is only one God. And he rules in the kingdom of men, and he can give it to whomsoever he wants. It busted this guy, this powerful man. But it took him a long time. So I love the chapter because chapter 4 will say to you, one day you will meet Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. One day. And you'll get to hear all of his stories and all of the color that we don't have here. So our dare tonight is very simple. Dare to surrender your life. It took him forever. But he speaks about how God changed his life, how the peace of God and the joy of God restored his life, how he acknowledged him as Lord. And from one of the cruelest men in history as far as, his behavior, you can walk away from this chapter saying, if God can reach him, he can reach anyone on your prayer list. Even Pop 12 years later, holding out. God can save politicians. I know, it's hard to believe, but it's true. And I don't doubt that Nebuchadnezzar was on the prayer list of Daniel and the boys for years, and they must have just gone, this is not going anywhere. But they must have marveled. When Jesus came to minister to that centurion servant, and he said, well, I'll come heal him. And the centurion said, Lord, I'm not worthy that you come under my roof. I'm a man under authority. I have men under me. I say to this one, go, and he goes, to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. I know if you'll just say it, he'll be well, he'll be healed. And it just floored Jesus. I haven't found this kind of faith anywhere. Now, nowhere in Israel is there anyone that has this kind of faith. And I think that's what the reaction must have been to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar did what? And how? Look, when man comes into an authentic contact with God, his life is changed. And one of the first things that changes is he's willing to submit to God's authority. He's willing to say, Lord, you be the Lord, I am not. When Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up in chapter 6, he said, my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. I'm undone. Peter in the boat by himself, not at all like that Son of God movie, fell on his knees, said, Lord, depart from me, I'm a sinful man. When you come to really know the Lord, you can't help but be humbled. You can't help but just bow. Well, that was Nebuchadnezzar. He was the ruler of the world. In fact, his rulership was so powerful, he had no one to answer to. Every succeeding generation that will come, every world kingdom, I should say, has a, not democratic, but has a checks and balance system. Nebuchadnezzar's doesn't. Jesus's won't either. But in between, there are all those checks and balances. Nebuchadnezzar was a law unto himself. And that man with that power was brought to his knees. There's an old saying, if your religion doesn't change you, maybe it's time to change your religion. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has his life, I'm just going to call him Neb. It's easier. Neb had his life turned upside down, and so have most of you. But I'll tell you, one of the most powerful works that you have, or tools that you have in your mission to reach the lost, is your testimony. What has God done with you? Usually when we hear testimonies, we hear dramatic ones like Nebuchadnezzar. We don't usually hear that I was raised in a Christian home and gave my life to Jesus at 4 or 5 or 6, and I don't ever remember doing much wrong other than, the things that the Lord knows within. I didn't run into drugs. We need testimonies like that, because there's lots of people going, I wonder what's wrong with me. I got no testimony. Your spiritual journey with Jesus can make a huge difference in the lives of others. I would suggest to you, just before even we begin these verses tonight, that if you haven't ever sat down and written out your testimony, you should. Work on it. Pull it out every week. Hone it. Make it clear and put the scriptures in that mattered to you and go over them and see what it sounds like to others and rehearse it and know it well. We are currently working with some folks, and if you're interested, you're welcome to call the office on selected communion nights. We're going to bring some folks up that have gotten saved here just to share their faith with you and what God has done in their life. Just for a few minutes, we'll ask them some questions. They can just kind of share with you what God has done in their life. And they'll be nervous because you all are scary looking. But I think it'll be real helpful to us, to encourage us to reach out, because God is able to reach the folks we have written off. That's for sure. On my 10th year high school reunion, the fellow who is now the mayor in Bellflower, I got saved in his house. And he and I graduated together. And he was so excited to take me, the drug dealing. I got great grades, by the way. I got full scholarship to UCI, but I was a total druggie. I don't know how that works. God's grace, I guess. But anyway, I got saved after I left high school and was pastoring by the time the 10-year anniversary rolled out. He couldn't wait to take me around to introduce me to all these guys that used to hang out with me. Guess what he doesn't know? Guess what he's doing now? Guess what he's doing? Take a guess, okay? And it wasn't pleasant. Wasn't even that well received. I didn't go to my 20th. But tonight I want to just go over and look at a man that God beat down before he was able to save. And sometimes, you know, I guess the question for tonight in daring to surrender would be, you know, what's it going to take for you to give up? Because some of us are tough enough to get a pretty good licking before we give up. And Nebuchadnezzar is the guy that would tell you that's a dumb way to go. So tonight we want to just take the vision that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar, the dream that he gave to him that spoke about what he was going to go through. And then next week, starting I think verse 19, we'll take a look at how it all turned out and what Nebuchadnezzar wants folks to know. The lesson, though, that is repeated again and again is this lesson: God rules in the kingdom of men. Somebody wants to say to me, what's your political affiliation? Here's my answer: God rules in the kingdom of men. You can see it in verse 3. You can see it in verse 17. You can find it again in verse 25, and again in verse 32, and in verse 34, and in verse 35. Dare to surrender. And like I said, Nebuchadnezzar got saved in the Old Testament sense, and I fully expect to see him in heaven. Verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all of the peoples and nations and languages that dwell in all of the earth. There's a powerful man, don't you think? Peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and the wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. El Elyon. How great are his signs. How mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. So on official Babylonian letterhead, king of the world, Nebuchadnezzar, he writes a spiritual autobiography of his own conversion. The journey that he took as ruler of the world to know God over those many years, how he came to know him, is the subject of the letter. James, I think it was in chapter, where is it? Chapter 4? Where it says God resists the proud, I think 4:6. Gives grace to the humble. He's a living example of that. God resists the proud. And Nebuchadnezzar, notice in verses 1, 2, and 3, states the purpose for his writing. This is what I've learned. This is what God has taught me. These are the things that I finally came to see in a personal way. He certainly sounds quite different than the guy in chapter 3 saying, bow or you die, don't push me on this. Right? An entirely different, and it is addressed to everyone upon the planet, because that was the scope of his rulership. Now, maybe that's a hard thing to grasp. Imagine a president going to the State of the Union and standing before Congress on national television and saying this: I have heard from God. I've come to know him personally. He alone is God. He rules in the kingdom of men. He calls us to serve him and acknowledge him and please him. He's the only one that we can serve and hope to be blessed by. And to have him say, I was a real tough customer. I had lots of pride and needed to be severely dealt with in order to surrender my life. But that I have done. And here's how God brought me to himself. And then to just use the State of the Union to give your testimony. Wouldn't that be something? Well, that's kind of what this is. This is that kind of deal, right? It's a first-person personal testimony written in his own handwriting or dictated to Daniel, whoever. But here's what I've learned. Now, let me tell you how it came to be, and that's really his story. And it is at least 8 years that the chapter itself covers. A year of rebellion, even after this dream, 7 years of insanity, and then a restoration. So let me just tell you what's taken place in my life the last 8 years or more. Verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house, and I was flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid. The thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head, they troubled me. And so I issued a decree to bring in all of the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. And the magicians and the astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, they came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the literally spirit of the gods. And I told the dream before him, and I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the gods is in you. No secret troubles you. Explain to me the vision of my dream that I've seen and the interpretation. Now, back to verse 4. Nicodemus had hit the stride in life. You know, there's oftentimes for folks who have worked hard all of their life, that place that the good life can begin. They don't last very long usually, but you don't work as hard as you once did, and you make more money than you used to, and things just kind of seem to line up. That's not always the case, but for some, you know, and that certainly was the case for Nicodemus. He was on top of the world. He was laying in his bed. He was greatly satisfied. Notice the words that he uses in verse 4. The word flourishing is an Aramaic word that literally means to blossom with greenness. It speaks of the spring, or of the fruitfulness of a life, if you will. And everything was so good for him, it couldn't have been better until he went to sleep. And for the second time in 45 years, at least by the accounts of what we are given, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this one shakes him. He had not lost a battle militarily. He had subdued the world around him. Life was smooth. Everything was cake. And then he went to sleep. And the thing that filled his mind rattled him. Hard to terrify a man who is in control of the world. Hard to get him on his knees, right? He is so powerful, and yet he is a slow learner. And for the second time, God shakes him to the core. Chapter 2 and 3, the 23 years apart. Now another 10 to 20 years have passed. There'll be at least 8 more years of ordeal here that will finally break him. But he's a defiant, unteachable, smug, self-centered, filled with himself, unsurrendered guy in all of his ways, and no one could do a thing about it except for the Lord. He was an untouchable except for the Lord. I'll tell you what you should learn early on from Nebuchadnezzar here. God can move you and impress you and shake you and make himself known to you, and you can still walk away. And he had. Daniel had told him his dream and the interpretation. The boys had defied his demand for worship, and they had survived the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, with his own eyes, saw a fourth man, like the son of the gods, there in the fire with him, and it hadn't turned him around. He was impressed. He was humbled, but he's the king of the world. How long can you stay humble? And he hadn't. And now comes another dream. This time, he remembers it. 40 years earlier, he'd forgotten it. He didn't understand it. I suspect because it frightened him. He knew it had something to do with him. It was ominous. It shook him. And the most prideful, powerful king knew that the news wasn't good. I was thinking the other day, how often have I had a dream from the Lord that was directive or predictive? You know, where the Lord tells you to do something, or He warns you of something that is coming. And my answer is never, that I can remember. Never. Now, I've heard from other people, even when we were shopping for buildings, I had a fellow call and said, I had a dream last night, and he told us about this building, and it was right. Never had that. My wildest dreams are usually following pizza and onions on the way home on Wednesday nights. I have lots of dreams. They're fairly colorful. I'm just not sure it's the Lord. But, you know, as I was thinking, I went back through the Bible again as I was writing some notes down on this passage, and I thought, you know, a lot of the people who were given dreams, aside from the prophets of God that through whom the Lord spoke, through them most directly and most often, that most of the other folks who got dreams in the Scriptures were not the most spiritual people. nor were they the ones through whom God would speak as much as to whom God would speak. And they didn't get them because they were more spiritual. Oftentimes they got them because they weren't spiritual at all. And they needed to hear from God, and they wouldn't listen to God any other way. Laban got a couple of dreams like that in the book of Genesis. Pharaoh heard from the Lord, right, about the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny ones. He wouldn't have listened to the Lord, so God got him when he was sleeping. The Midianites, as they were assaulting Israel, had some dreams about some fella named Gideon, and oh man, he was going to come wipe us out. Pontius Pilate's wife had a dream about Jesus, have nothing to do with that righteous man. Well, here Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and again, it's a guy that's not believing in God, walking with God, or concerned about God. He's filled with himself, and God gets him on his bed, and he starts hammering him. So maybe it's a good thing if you hadn't have too many dreams. Well, as before, 40 years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar calls for the wisest men of Babylon. He calls for the magicians and the cultists and the stargazers and the like. Those, by the way, who in chapter 2 he had completely disdained. He thought nothing of these guys. He even said to them, "Tell me what I've dreamed and then I'll believe you. Because I don't trust you guys. It's easy to make up stuff as you go." He hadn't thought very much of them. So you would think after 45 years of Daniel that he might have gone, "Let me talk to Daniel." But here's the deal when you're not right with God. Even when God has made himself known to you, when you're in trouble, you're going to reach for what's familiar. Even if it doesn't work. It's just what we do. We pray to the saints. We get a statue of somebody. We call out whoever it is. We want them to come out. Well, it doesn't work. It's never worked. I know, but what else are we going to do? And Nebuchadnezzar is just that kind of guy. He's just set in his ways, and this is what we do. So it hasn't worked before. He doesn't have much confidence in them. He sees them as phonies, but he calls for them anyway. It's interesting, isn't it? That if you don't have anything to grab a hold of, when you're in trouble, you got nothing to grab a hold of. And he had nothing. It's interesting that we read here as well that as they called him in, verse 7, they wouldn't tell him what it meant. I'm sure that they were used to making stuff up, but you know what? Daniel's waiting right outside. He's the chief of the magicians, verse 9. He's just let these guys go. I think he set this whole thing up again to say, well, you want to talk to my God now, or you still want to talk to these bozos? He sent the bozos in. And the bozos went, yeah, we have no idea. Yeah, he's still out there. We can't lie now. Because you know he's going to know, and we're going to look terrible. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar does to liars. Yeah, let us think about it. Hi, Daniel. How you doing? We don't know. And they didn't respond. And I think that's the way that Daniel intended it for it to be. He had a good reputation. He tolerated, the king did, these religious guys. He didn't have much confidence in them at all. It's interesting to me, people will tolerate you, but they usually will only call on you when there's trouble. I can't remember, but there were tons of times when I was working in a secular job where people they almost would avoid you because you'd bring your Bible to read at lunch or something, or they just knew you were a Christian. But the minute someone in their family was sick, they come right to me. Could you pray? And I wanted to say, why me? Go talk to your buddies, man. The beer gods. Go talk to the beer gods, I'm sure. But you go, of course I'll pray for you. But they see the difference. And Nebuchadnezzar's kind of like that too. It's life as usual, but man, he's not getting satisfied. Doesn't know where to turn. So we are told in verse 8, at last Daniel came before me. Now remember, this is the king's own words. I asked everyone else. I trusted in everything I was used to. And finally I go, all right, I got to talk to Daniel. Last resort, talk to that God guy. Pretty stubborn, isn't he? Let's talk to that guy. And Daniel comes in, and he is now distinct from everybody who's gone before him. It is from hopeless to hopeful. And the king, remembering the past with Daniel, man, 4 decades ago plus, encourages Daniel to help him again. Even says to him, I know you're the guy that can speak the truth. I never did trust any of these guys. Now, trust me, I called them first, but they got nothing. But you're my guy. You're my man. In you is the spirit of the holy gods. Those aren't words of faith from Nebuchadnezzar. Those are words of hope from a man who doesn't believe in God, and a man that, at least in all that he has done, has proven himself to be used by God. He even in verse 8 uses the name Daniel, his given name, and says, I changed his name. I changed his name. I changed his name so he would be named after my gods rather than after his. He's being honest now. He's been touched by the Lord. We talked about, I think, in chapter 1 about one of the crises that these young boys faced. Their identity was taken from them. But God kept them through all of the psychological ploys. Now here Daniel comes before this fella, and he's been praying for him maybe 40 plus years. And now he begins to see his prayers take root because there's something going on here. I think it was Vance Havner who once used to say, sometimes I preach time bombs. He said, I'll preach and then they'll go off years later. And that's pretty good. That's kind of what Daniel did. I think he's been praying for a long time, and the bombs are just about to go off now, you know. Now, what Nebuchadnezzar said was pagan in outlook, for real. But it does acknowledge the fact that he recognized a work of God in Daniel's life. He mentions it 3 times here, and it tells me that if the Lord is the Lord of your life, you won't need to tell people that. They'll see it. He was ignored by the king when all was well, but now the wheels come off, and let's go get Daniel. At the last, Daniel. I remember reading Henry Stanley's story about being with David Livingstone in Africa. And one of the things he wrote, he said, within 6 months of finding David Livingstone in Africa, I was saved. And he said, not because Livingstone ever preached to me, I just watched the way he lived. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. You know, you and I should know when you leave here tonight that people are watching you. They're carefully watching you because they hope you're for real. Because what they have isn't for real, and they know it. And there's coming a time when they're going to need to know the God that you know. Your life really is a fishbowl, because if people can discredit you, then they can discredit your word. He says to Daniel, I think almost in flattering ways, you've never been afraid of anything. No secret troubles you. I trust you. I trust you. So Daniel is known as a man not easily rattled, who keeps his eyes on the Lord, not shaken by circumstances. Daniel, I've watched you. Now tell me, or let me tell you my dream, and then you tell me what it means. I think I'm being watched. Verse 10. These were the visions of my head while I was on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew, and it became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. It could be seen to the ends of all of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heaven dwelt in its branches. All flesh was fed from it. And I saw in the visions of my head while I was upon my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven. He cried aloud. He said thus, cut down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump, the roots in the earth, bind it with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man, let him be given the heart of a beast. Let 7 times pass over him, for this is the decision by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men. He gives it to whomever he wills. He can even set over it the lowest of men. Well, this dream I, Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare its interpretation, since all of the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you're able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. So, we reading that might say, well, we get who that tree is. That's you. You've grown large and tall, and you provide food for the world. You reach to the ends of the earth. Everyone knows who you are. Everyone depends upon you. All the world depends upon your rulership. But having seen that, he then in verse 13 turns to the problem. Somebody that was watching him, a holy one that was coming down from heaven, who began then to speak these words that we just read beginning in verse 14. The word watcher in verse 13 is singular. The word watchers later on in verse 17 is plural. There is a divergence of opinion as to who the watchers were. Some people believe that this is none other than God himself, the plural being like Elohim, the Godhead. Others believing it is simply a reference to angels sent to watch over us. The lesson would be the same. God knows and sees all. So there's no problem with, take whatever you like. I personally believe it is a reference to the Lord himself. I think the lesson is never forget that when no one is looking, God is still watching. I think it was Louis Sperry Schaefer who once wrote, "Secret sins upon the earth are open scandals in heaven." God knows. But whatever and whoever the watchers are, they come with a terrible announcement. And the announcement is cut down the tree. Strip off the leaves. Scatter the fruit. Get rid of those who depend upon the tree for food and shelter. Cut the tree down. But fortunately, there's some good news. Don't get rid of it completely. It looked like the end for the tree, but it was not, and restoration could follow. The tree looks a lot like Nebuchadnezzar's verse 4, "I'm flourishing." It's almost the same word for greenness of a tree. But I also want you to notice that in verse 15, you read the words, "it," let it be filled with dew, let it be cut down. In the middle of verse 15, or at the end of verse 15, you read the words, "and let him." And it changes to a personal pronoun. Let him graze with the beast. Let his heart be changed. Let him be given the heart of the beast until 7 times pass over him. So the image to the application, and I think Nebuchadnezzar followed it fine. Verse 16 tells us that the declaration from heaven is that this man would be given the heart of an animal, the heart of a beast, that it would last for 7 times, a very prophetic term that is always a reference to years. So this is literally a declaration that 7 years would come and go, and Nebuchadnezzar would have his heart changed from that of a man to that of a beast, and he would live in the dew of the fields, and he would graze with the beasts, and he would literally be driven away from his position as king or overseer or lord of all, and he would be reduced to just an animal who responds, if you will, to just the way an animal does. Now, there is a psychotic disorder that psychiatrists have labeled. They have 3 or 4 examples of it in the last 100 years where people absolutely thought they were animals and lived in the fields and in the grasses and ate with the... It's obviously a rare thing. There are also 2 secular references to Nebuchadnezzar's illness outside of the Bible. The Babylonian historian Berassus writes about it. The Greek historian Abeelen in 286 BC writes about it as well. So this world king, and you would expect to have some reference to it, is being told by the Lord he was a tree that filled the earth, but one day, because of his pride, God is going to take him out. And he's going to live for 7 years like an animal. He's not going to have any power or any authority. He is just going to be kind of subject to these kind of things. Now, Nebuchadnezzar didn't get it all yet. Daniel will tell him, but just, the dream didn't sound good. Verse 17, though, has the lesson. That this was the decision by the decree of the watchers. And again, I say I think it's the Lord only because I don't think the angels give decrees. And this is the sentence by the word of the holy ones. Here's what you need to learn, Nebuchadnezzar, that all of the living might know it's the Most High who rules in the kingdom of men. He gives it to whomever he will, and he can even set over the kingdoms of men the lowest of men. So, I think that's proved in a lot of societies, that God allows the lowest of men to rule. And we wonder, Lord, where are you? Well, men are going to have to learn that God rules. To argue you are in charge may simply define you as the lowest of men. God rules, he decides. Well, Nehemiah writing this says this was the purpose for his 7 years of insanity, and of course written after the fact. This is what God intended for me. This is what he wanted to come out of it. This is what I went through to come to the conclusion that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, that God appoints human government and oversees them all. Now, let me say that to you who are not happy with your current government. God rules in the kingdom of men. And I know you're frustrated, but God is good. And so rather than complain, pray for your president, for the Congress, for the senator. Just pray. Remember this, Nebuchadnezzar got saved in the Old Testament sense. He had to go pretty far down. He was brought pretty low, and some of you were brought pretty low before you wised up. But praise the Lord, you eventually listened. God will even allow the worst to rule from time to time. Pharaoh was not a nice man. Neither was Herod the Great. Neither was Antiochus Epiphanes. Neither was Nebuchadnezzar. Neither was Nero. Horrible, wicked men. Well, God, how could you? Look, God knows what he's doing. His intention is to bring people to their knees. It doesn't mean God approves of their behavior, but he reserves control of their appointment. For us, it should mean that no matter who's in power, we have a responsibility to submit to those over us as unto the Lord. It's a hard concept to grasp. But wicked rulers are used by the Lord. And if you want to do a good study, go through the Bible and find every wicked ruler and see how God used them. To punish, to avenge, to purify. He does all things well. And until you are ordered by your government to do that which God expressly forbids, you are really obligated to submit. So, learn that God rules. You'll be at a greater peace if you'll just know that the Lord's in charge. What is he doing? I don't know. Whenever you come to me with the words, why is God? My answer is, I don't know. Do you think the Lord? I don't know. If you want to speak for the Lord, I can't. I can just tell you what he told us. I can't explain his doings. They're beyond our finding out. So don't even try. But what do we have to do? We have to learn to surrender to God's authority and to live that way with great joy. In verse 18, Nebuchadnezzar says to Daniel, help me. This is what I, as the king, have seen. Help me. No one else can help me. Can you help me? How harsh does life have to get before you'll listen? For Nicodemus. Now, we're going to do the rest next week, but look at verse 29. It says this, or verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, and at the end of 12 months, that means another year passes, he's walking around the royal palace. This is what he said. Is this not the great Babylon that I have built by my power for the honor of my majesty? Yeah, bad move, dude. Remember the tree thing? While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell down from heaven. So, how hard does it have to get before you'll surrender? Dare to surrender. Here's the dare. Dare to surrender. Let God be God. He's going to be God anyway. You can go, oh, not in my life. Oh, yes, he will. Maybe too late. You may just find judgment, but you're going to do what he says eventually. And tonight he holds your breath in his hands, and if he's done with you, you stop breathing. So dare to surrender. And for us as Christians, we got to do the same thing. We got to surrender to the Lord. Quit giving up. Oh, look at our country. Look at our... Oh. Look at our God. He's awesome. He's good. He's for us, not against us. He's got good things. He does all things well. All the time. So quit with your whining. Start praising. Clap hands. Clap your hands, man. Sing loud. Praise the Lord. He's worthy to be praised. Father, we thank you tonight for putting up with us and for teaching us so much. And we pray that as we next week can continue, Lord, if you be willing with the wonderful story of Nebuchadnezzar, that we would, Lord, realize that the testimony we have, the work that you've done in our lives is powerful. And so awesome, Lord, that you would include in your word the written testimony of a pagan world king who over half a century almost learned that you, Lord, rule in the kingdom of men, that you give it to whomever you want, that you're the God to whom he would bow his knee, and he would write a letter to everyone under his kingdom in the whole earth to declare his faith in you. May you give us, Lord, the ability to share our testimony, what you've done with us and for us. And if you haven't ever done that, pray about how you can just begin to write it out. You can erase it. You can share it with your wife or your friends. Let them help you so that God might use what he has done in your life to touch the lives of others. Powerful. People just want to hear real truth. Your life is real. There's a movie coming out in a few weeks, Heaven is for Real. That's not for real. Not in my Bible. But your life being changed, that's for real. God came to you and saved you. And he certainly changed the heart of the world ruler Nebuchadnezzar, who thought he had it all together. And he's telling us how this took place. But man, what a price to pay just to be right with God. You don't have to go that far down. You can just get saved right where you're at, even tonight. Pastors will be up front after the service. Come and pray with them. Just a simple prayer of acknowledging who the Lord is and why he wants us to come, and he sent his son so that we would embrace him, find eternal life. It's real easy. Oh, it wasn't easy for him, but the method is easy. The steps are simple. If you're willing to surrender, if you dare to surrender, the fruit will be marvelous, priceless, glorious. Tonight you can come and be saved. And for you who are saved, man, take some of those Easter flyers. Go tell people about what God's done for you. Be a witness. Dare to surrender. Let God use your life. People are desperate to have some answers. They're frightened. Their future is unsure. You're fine. And it's only going to get better for you. May God use you to tell others of why that's so. Shall we stand?